Hey, what's up, Seekers? Welcome back. Would you believe me if I told you that a philosophical text fabricated in the 9th century by a Syrian Christian translator and a Muslim philosopher, attributed to one of, if not the most important Western philosophers of all time, went on to fool centuries of philosophers, making this text, which actually contained the teachings of one of the most influential philosophical mystics of the West, go on to influence hundreds of years of Arabic philosophy, influencing everyone from Ibn Sina, Al-Farabi, Ibn Tufayl, Sadra, Ibn Ezra, Ibn Falquera, Ibn Gabriel, and Moses Maimonides. The last of which we'll be paying particularly close attention to, seeing how he struggles back and forth between a certain peculiar notion of God that he adopts from the spurious pseudepigraphic text and his more conventional notion of God. In the last episode, we spoke about Maimonides' primary philosophical influence, a man by the name of Aristotle, as he'd been filtered through the lenses of Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Rushd, Al-Ghazali, and others. I'll put up a tier list here on screen that I made so you can see who Maimonides' favorite philosophers were. But we mentioned that there was another source text, which was immensely influential on the religious philosophical thought of the Middle Ages, which falls into the mix of Maimonides' influences in a very big way. The text in question goes by the imposing title, The Theology of Aristotle, attributed to none other than the great student of Plato, one of the three founding fathers of Western philosophy, none other than, you guessed it, the great Aristotle himself, as the title indicates, the man whom Maimonides, among others, simply refers to as the philosopher, the man he considered to have reached the peak of human intellection, reaching with the power of his mind alone just shy of prophecy. Maimonides considered Aristotle to be his philosophical master and mentor, studying and accepting his master's logic, ethics, physics, and metaphysics from an early age, and anything from the pen of his master would have been of major importance to him, all the more so a text purportedly containing his master's theology. For hundreds of years, devout students of Aristotle, Maimonides amongst them, swallowed up the theology, this text attributed to Aristotle, grappling with it deeply and incorporating it into their own philosophies and theologies. The only slight itty-bitty problem is that not a word from this text was authored by Aristotle or from anyone in his peripatetic school. It turns out that the so-called Theology of Aristotle was actually a 9th century Arabic paraphrase of selections of book 4 through 6 of Plotinus's Enneads. The Enneads, for those that don't know, are the primary texts recording the teachings of Plotinus, the founding father of Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism, I hear you asking, is the modern name given to a way of doing Platonic philosophy that gained traction in the Greco-Roman world in the 3rd century CE. Neoplatonism, in the words of Wildberg, was a grandiose and powerfully persuasive system of thought, a ground synthesis of a millennia of rich and profound intellectual heritage. The school of Neoplatonism emerged from the teachings of its founder Plotinus and his students, people like Porphyry, Iamblichus, Proclus, and Damascius, and went on to occupy the religious, philosophical thought of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers during the Middle Ages, vying for supremacy against its arch-philosophical nemesis, Aristotelianism, for hundreds of years, in one of the longest-standing and most exciting philosophical rivalries of recorded history, each school competing for the crown of the philosopher king. The result of all this is that the so-called Theology of Aristotle was a text that did not only not belong to Aristotle's school of thought, but in fact belonged to the pens of his arch-rivals, the philosophical rivals, the Neoplatonists. In addition to Plotinus's Enneads, the pseudo-theology of Aristotle, which so influenced Maimonides and so many of his contemporary Jewish, Muslim, and Christian thinkers, also contains an adaptation of Proclus's Elements of Theology, another early important Neoplatonic text, in addition to some other random Neoplatonic material that got thrown into the writer's mix. In short, the Theology of Aristotle was not much of a theology of Aristotle at all. It would only be 400 years after Maimonides finished writing his guide that the Renaissance philosopher Francesco Patrizi of Cherso would attempt to make sense of the non-Aristotelianness of the Theology of Aristotle by proposing that Aristotle had returned back in his old age to the teachings of his master Plato, and it was then that this text was composed. 125 years later, in 1716, Johann Albert Fabricius, the classicist and bibliographer, remarked in his Bibliotheca Graecia that the positions espoused in the theology were clearly Platonic and not Aristotelian. It would only be another century before the text was connected directly with Plotinus and Neoplatonism by the prolific translator himself, a Neoplatonist, Thomas Taylor, in his 1812 dissertation on the philosophy of Aristotle. I'd like to thank Professor Diana Cotta for so kindly pointing me to her research on this question. Yet, despite all that we know with our 2020 hindsight about this 9th century misattributed forgery, the Theology of Aristotle, according to Sarah Pessin, Alfred Ivry, and others, is one of the most important sources to keep in mind while reading Maimonides' philosophy, and must be read in connection with any serious study of Maimonides, despite the fact that he never cites the text explicitly. The theology was likely compiled and edited by Al-Himzi, a Syrian Christian translator, and Al-Kindi, the father of Arabic philosophy, or by someone in their circle, and is a fascinating text not only because it becomes the single most important conduit for the philosophy of Neoplatonism into the Arabic-speaking world of the Middle Ages, but also because the text is not just a straight translation of Neoplatonic thought, but also in itself an early attempt to integrate the thought of Plotinus and Aristotle, Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism, while also keeping a keen eye to their compatibility with the religious thought of Christianity and Islam, with the Bible and the Quran, thus creating a unique Arabic version of Plotinus, the Plotiniana Arabica, with immense philosophical influences for centuries to come. And here comes the unexpected, or maybe not so unexpected, punchline. Neoplatonism, for those who are unaware, besides for being a magnificent philosophical system, is also understood by most contemporary scholars to be a form of philosophical mysticism, which at its core consists of an attempt to reconcile the existence of the one, the only true existence, the infinite, the eternal, the absolute, the philosophical stand-in for God for all practical terms and purposes, with the many, the transient, the finite, the contingent, the composite, namely reality as it appears to our limited senses. This fundamental question that underlies all of Neoplatonic thought is, to paraphrase Wildeburg's modern formulation, how are we to understand the emergence of the physical material universe with all of its diverse phenomena from a singularity of consciousness that is in every sense unlike this universe? The way that Neoplatonism went about attempting to answer this question of the one and the many went far beyond any previous attempt in both elegance and sophistication, and would become the bedrock of mystical philosophical speculation in the West for centuries to come. Plotinus, the founder of the Neoplatonic school, was not merely one of the greatest theoreticians and philosophers of mysticism that we know of from the ancient West, but also, as we know from his student's description, himself had been described as experiencing union with the One, the Absolute, with God, on numerous occasions throughout his lifetime, an experience referred to by the Neoplatonists as henosis, to become one with the One. Plotinus, however, the fine philosopher mystic that he is, refuses to even call these moments of union experiences because the word experience implies a dichotomy between the experiencer and that which is being experienced, a dichotomy which Plotinus believes, like all dichotomies, to be fundamentally false. All that he believes happens in these moments is that it is revealed to us that which we truly are and always were. Plotinus, building on the work of Plato, the man he considers to be his philosophical and spiritual master and predecessor, goes on to construct a meticulous and spectacular metaphysics of the one true reality and its interactions with the many perceived reality, a metaphysics that goes on, as we said, to influence and shape hundreds of years of philosophical mysticism in both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Neoplatonism, in Wildeburg's felicitous articulation, absorbed, appropriated, and creatively harmonized almost the entire tradition of Greek myth, philosophy, religion, and literature. The Neoplatonists offered a kind of meta-discourse and reflection on the sum total of ideas produced over centuries of sustained inquiry into the human condition. And the primary text of Neoplatonism, Plotinus's Enneads, compiled by his student Porphyry, which took on some odd packaging over the centuries as we've been discussing, remained an overflowing fountainhead for both some seriously rigorous and beautiful thinking, soaring to the heights of the universe and to the depths of the human condition in ways that continue to astound both mystic and logician alike. And it is from this grand synthesis of rational philosophy and mystical ecstasy, this fountainhead of philosophical mysticism, as conveyed through the Arabic misattributed theology of Aristotle, that Maimonides, otherwise pure rationalistic Aristotelianism, unbeknownst even to him, absorbs a different air, shall we say a more mystical air. And this is why, when scholars today speak of Maimonides' primary philosophical influences, they speak not of plain Aristotelianism, but of a Neoplatonized Aristotelianism. The plot thickens. Another way that Neoplatonism, by the way, makes its way into Maimonides' thinking is via the Shia Muslim school of Ismailism. Ismaili philosophy sought a synthesis between Greek philosophy and Islamic thought, and was itself significantly influenced by Neoplatonic thought as found in the Theology of Aristotle and other major texts. Maimonides, in Ivry's opinion, may have encountered Ismaili philosophy in Egypt later on in his life, which might explain why we see him seemingly responding to various themes raised by Ismaili thinkers in his later work. Over the course of its own development, Ismaili thought had gradually become more focused on explicating the inner esoteric side of Islam, the batin as it's known, making Maimonides' dialogue with this tradition another source of mystical philosophical influence for him. Let us then unpack the primary themes of Neoplatonism as Maimonides would have encountered them in the Theology of Aristotle, so that we can begin to make sense of Maimonides' possible mysticism and tease out what in his thought might be attributed properly to Aristotelianism and what to Neoplatonism, which is no simple task, but stay with me, we got this. Sarah Pessin, in her brilliant essay, outlines the primary ideas about God which make their way from the Neoplatonic theology of Aristotle into the mind of Maimonides and his contemporary Jewish and Muslim thinkers. They are 1. That God is pure unity, pure goodness, and pure being. That 2. God is the creator and first cause of all existence. And 3. That God, the One, brings all of existence into being by emanating forth in a chain of emanations beginning with intellect, nous or logos, followed then by the world soul, and then by nature itself. Perhaps the most important theme that emerges from the Theology of Aristotle that we see here in these principles is what Christina d'Ancona calls the double journey of the soul, which is the way that the soul descends along this great chain of being, the cosmic hierarchy of the One, the intellect, the soul, and nature, and the way that it heads back towards its origins and homeland through this cosmic chain back to the realm of the incorporeal eternal principles, the spiritual union with the intelligible realm, and ultimately through them to the first cause, to the One, to God, God's self. The origin and destination narrative in the language of Ibn Sina, which according to Christina is one of the most influential philosophical ideas conveyed in the Theology of Aristotle, paving the way for the creation of one of the most pervasive topics of Islamic philosophy as a whole, the theory of the conjunction of the human intellect with the separate intellect, and ultimately sometimes with God. We'll explain what those things are in a moment. If we pay close attention, we could see the directionality of the first idea that we laid out. God's unity, goodness, and purity is upwards, towards transcendence, away from our world of multiplicity, ambiguity, and decay. And the second 2 principles, God as the first cause and emanator of the universe into existence, points back downwards towards us, towards creation, instantiation, manifestation, and materialization. This Neoplatonic schema, which we've outlined here in the briefest of words, describes the way that for the Neoplatonists, the world itself comes into existence, as well as the ultimate purpose and goal of mankind. Not too shabby. And we're going to see how this dance of being, manifesting via the intellect into existence, and its return through the intellect into the source of being, finds its way into Maimonides' thought as well, and wherein might just lie his philosophical mysticism. Let's explore these metaphysical directions and theological propositions as they find themselves in Maimonides' thought, and talk a little about the God of Maimonides. God for Maimonides, in his idiosyncratic blend of Judaism, Aristotelianism, and Neoplatonism, is an absolutely simple, absolutely necessary, completely uncaused unity who is pure intellect and the first cause of all existence. It is here that we begin to see Maimonides' unique blend of Aristotle and Plotinus, Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism. From Aristotle, Maimonides gets his notion of God as intellect and first cause, the unmoved mover. And from Neoplatonism, unbeknownst to him, he gets his notion of God as pure goodness, unity, and simplicity. But this mixture, as we will see, is going to get a little complicated, because while for Aristotle, God is identified as the first cause, a pure immaterial intellect whose self-cognizing cognition actualizes the cosmos, for Plotinus and Neoplatonism, God is understood to be a pure unity which transcends the intellect, and even transcends being itself. God for Plotinus is hyperousia, is beyond being. God as intellect, and God as beyond everything including intellect, is what faced the leading philosophers and theologians of the Middle Ages, and it's in their reception of the Theology of Aristotle by thinkers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, where Plotinus's God as pure unity gets merged with Aristotle's God as pure intellect. We're going to see how these two conflicting ideas of God play out in Maimonides' thought. Just a small side note on the language that we're using here. The Greek word that we've been translating here as intellect, nous, because that's how everyone translates it, doesn't exactly mean intellect the way that we use that word commonly today. It means something more like consciousness or mind in the most abstract sense of the word, so keep that in mind when you hear us using the word intellect. Okay. The first theological notion and her ramifications, which we'd like to look at here today, which develops from Maimonides out of his reading of the Theology of Aristotle, is the concept of God as pure being. This pure being from Maimonides is by definition so utterly unified that it transcends any possibility of any internal division. As Maimonides writes, God, may God be exalted, is one in all respects. No multiplicity should be posited for God, for there is nothing that can be added to God's essence. This radical purity and unity, believes Maimonides in good Neoplatonic fashion, precludes us from making almost any positive affirmations about God at all. This position, a staple of Neoplatonic thought, is referred to as apophatic or negative theology, wherein all that we can say about God is what God is not, for to say anything positive would imply some sort of limitation or multiplicity in God. We therefore cannot, according to Maimonides, affirm anything at all about God in the positive. Therefore, when the Tanakh or later Jewish literature say, for example, that God lives, what is really only meant, according to Maimonides, is that God is not subject to death. Likewise, when we say that God is powerful and knowing and willing, what we're really only saying is that God is neither powerless nor ignorant nor negligent. Even to say that, for example, God is pure unity, according to this, would be saying too much. All we could say, as Maimonides seeks to prove in his guide and in the opening chapters of his Mishnah Torah, that God is not and cannot be comprised of any multiplicity. All that we can say is that God is not a composite entity, and to imply from that its opposite, that God is a simple pure unity. But not, God forbid, that God is united in our human conception of what unity means, for that would be to compare our reality with God's, a fundamental theological mistake if there ever were one. Rather, God's unity, reaffirmed after having been negated, points us towards a unity that is utterly unlike any terrestrial unity that we know of. This is the process of negative theology for Maimonides, which begins with a naive affirmation, God is one, for example, which then must be negated. God is not comprised of any multiplicity, to continue the example, which then in turn returns us to a higher affirmation, God's essence is completely simple and unified in a way that we cannot comprehend, for nothing can be added to God's essence, to finish the example. And even to say that borders on what cannot be said. For God, according to Maimonides, writes Sarah Pesson, transcends the normal parameters of language and conceptualization. This act of negation clears the way for a genuine religious experience. As Diana Lobel writes, the process of divesting God of false attributes brings humans closer to who or what God truly is. Only by stripping away ignorance can we approach genuine knowledge. The less we claim to know about God, the more accurate our knowledge about God will actually be. In the end of the day, on Maimonides' account, all that we can really know is that God is, not what God is. As Lobel writes, when our mind tries to overstep its legitimate knowledge to perceive God's essence, it is in danger of losing its genuine perception of God's existence. All that we can legitimately know is that the existence of this contingent world requires a being whose existence is necessary. And it is here that we encounter Maimonides' radical conception of God's absolute transcendence, a God who cannot be touched, known, or even barely spoken about, which he inherits from the Neoplatonists via the Theology of Aristotle, in addition to his classical Jewish sources. However, an utterly transcendent God poses a few challenges for theology. Firstly, such a transcendent, removed God seems no longer to be legitimately identifiable with the theistic God of the Bible, a God who cares, listens, and answers prayers, who creates, reveals, and redeems, who rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. At best, we could call this transcendent, removed God the God of deism, but the God of religion and most of Judaism certainly seems to be a lot more personal and interactive than what we might get out of a deistic God, about whom we can affirm veritably nothing. The second challenge posed to this radically transcendent notion of God is the, at least apparent, existence of the universe. We would need to understand how an utterly simple, pure, unchanging, and removed God could bring about a material, diverse, and complex universe into existence. And it's here that we segue into our second metaphysical direction, that of downwards. Turning back to the Theology of Aristotle, we find two key ideas about creation. One is that the way that God creates the world is via a process of emanation, and two, that God creates/emanates because of God's goodness and fullness, since it is the nature of good to do good, to share and to give, and the nature of fullness to overflow. And the thing which God is full of is existence, being, and it is that which God overflows. This idea finds its roots in Plato and is later fleshed out by Plotinus, the notion that God is so bountiful, good, generous, and unjealous that God almost by definition must overflow God's being in an act of creation/emanation. According to this line of thinking, God creates in virtue of God's very essence, and this creating is done not by God creating something separate or outside of God's self, but rather by emanating existence from God's very self. Even if the language of creation, even sometimes creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, is used here and there, it is very clear from the context that what's being spoken of is emanation, namely a way of bringing something into being by flowing one's very own existence into it. An important distinction, just to clarify, between creation and emanation for this context is that while in the act of creation, as it is typically conceived, the creator and that which are created are fundamentally other and separate from one another. They are ontologically irreconcilable, to get fancy with it. With emanation, on the other hand, as it's usually conceived, there exists between the emanator and the emanated an unbroken flow. They gradually shade into one another through a series of gradations which almost imperceptibly change from, over the course of a long spectrum, from one into the other, from emanator into emanated. And the possibility remains for the bridge of emanation to be traversed back against the flow of existence, back from the emanated into the emanator, back into its source. A journey which would be entirely impossible and inconceivable under the rubric of creation, in which the creator and the created can never merge, where there is no bridge but an uncrossable metaphysical chasm which abruptly ruptures between creator and creature in the act of creation. For the emanationist, however, the cosmos is not something which is fundamentally other or separate from God, but is rather an extension of God, God's self. Without getting too deeply into the many heated debates surrounding Maimonides' theory of creation, let us suffice with quoting the guide, where Maimonides himself writes, "For the universe exists in virtue of the existence of the Creator. For the Creator continually endows the universe with permanence through what we call the overflow." Here we see Maimonides positing a theory of creation, more properly a theory of emanation despite the wording that he's using, in which 1. God is the cause of existence, 2. God is the continual sustainer of existence, by the virtue of 3. An overflow from the divine, Fayed in the original Arabic of the guide, translated by Ibn Tübingen as shefa, meaning abundance, excess, or overflow. A word, by the way, which is going to be picked up by the Kabbalists and become a very important concept for them in their metaphysics. It is between these two ideas of God, namely God is pure unity, unchanging and transcendent, about which nothing can be said, a God who is so unified as to be beyond being, the God of Plotinus, and, on the other hand, God who is pure and perfect intellect, contemplating itself, the knower, the knowing, and the known, who in its act of knowing moves the universe from a state of potential into a state of actuality. A God about whom something indeed can be said, the God of Aristotle. Between a God who is the ultimate cause of all being, the active, overflowing emanator, perpetually perpetuating the world into existence by emanating and overflowing itself into the universe, Plotinus, versus a God who merely drops the first domino of a cascading cosmos, the prime unmoved mover of Aristotle. It is here that we find the paradox at the crux of Maimonides' thought. Caught as he is between Plotinus and Aristotle, the treacherous intersection between these two primary metaphysical directions, the tension in Maimonides' theological engine. And we see this tension running through the guide, with Maimonides at times describing God as the form of the world, namely the intellect of the world, the knower, the knowing, and the known, and as the mover of the first celestial sphere, and at other times he describes God as transcending all separate cosmic intellects. We'll explain what those are soon, and telling us clearly that God is not to be identified as the separate intellect, the mover of the first sphere. If you're bothered by these contradictions in the guide that I'm implying, May I refer you to the introduction in which Maimonides tells the reader that there will be contradictions in this text. I put them there for a reason. And Maimonides himself acknowledges this contradiction, writing, "How God rules the universe and provides for it is a complete mystery that the human mind is incapable of solving. For on the one hand, it can be proven that God is separate from the universe and has no contact with it whatsoever. But on the other hand, it can be proven that God's governance and providence exists in all parts of the universe, even in the smallest of things. Praise be God, whose perfection has dazzled us and is beyond our comprehension." Maimonides finds himself delightfully caught between these two conceptions of God, and expresses his humility in the face of the mystery of all existence. Like Einstein, who felt like a small child lost in the National Library, engulfed by languages he didn't even yet know how to read when pondering the mysteries of the universe, and like Newton, who felt like a child playing with some shiny pebbles on the seashore, barely wetting his feet, while the secrets of reality laid entirely unexplored as the ocean before him, Maimonides, dazzled by the very same light, is forced to his knees in humility, writing that he is like a child knowing nothing, driven to praise, Yishtabach mish yitzchenu shleimusei, praise be the one by whose perfection we are conquered, overwhelmed, and overcome. Who at the moment that the human mind attempts to glance at your essence, their understanding turns faulty. At the moment of glancing at the necessary correlation between your will and your actions, knowledge turns to ignorance. When the tongue attempts to exalt God with attributes, all eloquence turns into ineptitude and faultiness. I'd like to end off with an exquisite quote from the Theology of Aristotle, and I'd like you to pay attention to the themes that it brings to the fore, which we've discussed already, and to those which we shall, God willing, discuss in the upcoming episodes. The text reads, "Often I have been alone with my soul, and have shed my body and laid it to the side, and become as if I were naked substance without body, so as to be inside myself, outside of all other things, and to be knowledge, knower, and known at once. Then do I see within myself such beauty and splendor, as I do remain marveling at it and astonished, so that I know that I am but a part of the sublime, transcendent, lofty divine world, and possess active life. When I am certain of that, I lift my intellect from that world into the divine cause, and become as if I were placed in it, and cleaving to it, so as to be above the entire intelligible world, and seem to be standing in that sublime and divine place. And there I see such light and splendor as tongues cannot describe, nor is comprehend." Thank you for joining us as we seek that which cannot be described or comprehended. Thank you to our patrons who support us in this project. If you can afford them, please do consider joining us. And I would like to thank Shalom College for letting me film on their premises. Thank you, Seth. Join us next week as we continue to explore the metaphysics of Maimonides. Please check out the playlist that we have so far covered on Maimonides to catch up to speed if you're not already. And as always, keep seeking.